I've always been proud of my solar grid. For me, it wasn't just a home improvement project, it was a dream years in the making. After what felt like an eternity of saving, researching, and planning, I finally had panels installed across my roof. They gleamed in the sunlight like a silent army of black glass soldiers, capturing energy and feeding it straight into a state-of-the-art battery system tucked neatly in my garage. I'd spent countless late nights reading manuals, comparing inverter specs, and calculating energy outputs like a man obsessed. Even my wife used to joke that our garage had started to look like a NASA control room, and maybe she was right. But when the system came online, it felt like a personal victory. Clean, reliable, self-produced energy that cut my power bills in half and gave me a sense of independence I'd never felt before. That's why, when the trouble began, it stung so deeply. You see, when you build something yourself, you develop a kind of protective pride. That solar grid wasn't just some expensive toy. It was the culmination of years of discipline and planning. I'd even had to convince my wife that this wasn't one of my mad scientist projects, as she liked to call them whenever I got too excited about wiring diagrams. But the day the panels went up and the battery hummed to life, even she admitted it was impressive. We both stood in the driveway, arms crossed, admiring the clean lines of the panels and the digital readouts flickering on the app. It was ours energy, independence. Right there in our suburban cul-de-sac. And that's when Karen entered the picture. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the HOA Karen. If you've ever lived under a homeowners association, you know exactly who I'm talking about. Clipboard in one hand, a phone poised to call the board in the other, and a nose that could sniff out a rule violation from 3 streets away. Her obsession with control was almost comical, like a sitcom character brought to life. She'd been known to measure grass height with a ruler, report minor paint color variations, and take photographs of trash cans left out past pickup time. In her mind, she wasn't just a resident, she was the sheriff of the neighborhood, self-pointed and self-righteous. When I installed my solar panels, I braced myself for Karen's inevitable complaints. I half expected her to march up my driveway, wagging her finger about unsightly panels or non-compliance with aesthetic guidelines. But, strangely, she never did. She'd glance at them sometimes when she walked by, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but she never said a word. For a while, I thought maybe she'd mellowed out. Perhaps my system was so neatly installed that even she couldn't find fault. I should have known better. Karen had a Tesla, and not just any Tesla. Pristine, gleaming Model Y in pearl white. She treated that car like royalty, washing it twice a week, polishing the wheels until they sparkled. She'd brag about it at HOA meetings, extolling its zero-emissions virtue and making not-so-subtle jabs at the gas guzzlers some of the other neighbors drove. I didn't care. Good for her, I thought. Electric cars are great. But then, about 2 months after my system went live, something strange began happening. It started subtly. My solar grid's smart monitor showed tiny blips of energy usage late at night. Strange, because by then my wife and I were always asleep, and the house was dark. I dismissed it at first as a glitch, or maybe the battery balancing itself. But the blips grew into spikes. Massive spikes. At first 3 kilowatts, then 5, then 10. Enough to drain a significant chunk of my overnight reserve. By morning my battery would be half empty when it should have been full. I'm a patient man, but I'm also curious. After a few nights of watching the numbers climb, I decided to investigate. I checked my indoor appliances, nothing unusual. The HVAC was off, the lights off, everything normal. But the numbers didn't lie. Someone or something was pulling power from my grid. Finally, on a Tuesday night, I opened my garage security camera app on my phone. What I saw nearly made me drop the phone. There she was, HOA Karen herself, creeping into my driveway like a raccoon after dark. She was dressed in a hoodie and slippers, of all things, glancing around nervously. In her hands was a charging cable, which she smoothly plugged into the heavy-duty solar-powered outlet mounted on the side of my garage, the one designed for my tools and, occasionally, my cousin's electric motorcycle when he visited. And there, idling silently under the glow of the streetlight, was her beloved Tesla, sipping my solar energy like a vampire at a blood bank. I couldn't believe it. All this time, Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of rules, had been sneaking over in the dead of night to steal electricity from my system. My electricity, the very system she probably would have tried to ban if she'd thought of it first. The hypocrisy was staggering. I watched her on the live feed as she checked her phone, probably watching her car's charge percentage rise, then strutted back to her house as if she owned the place. The first night I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe she thought the outlet was public. Maybe she assumed it was some kind of community charger. But then, she came back, and back again. Night after night, she drained my battery until my morning readouts looked like I'd powered a small factory overnight. And each time, she wore that same smug smile in the morning, waving cheerily as if nothing had happened. My jaw clenched. My hands tightened around my phone. This wasn't just freeloading, it was theft. And coming from Karen, of all people, it was the ultimate insult. I didn't say anything the first night. Maybe she'd made a mistake, I told myself. Maybe she'd thought the outlet on the side of my garage was some sort of communal resource. Or maybe she assumed it was tied to the HOA's budget and not my own carefully built solar grid. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was an innocent misunderstanding. After all, no one in their right mind would repeatedly sneak onto a neighbor's property to siphon electricity. That was the sort of thing you read about in petty crime reports. Not something respectable suburban homeowners actually did. But then it happened again, and again, night after night, like clockwork. My logs lit up with the same story, enormous spikes in usage between midnight and 4 in the morning. What had started as small, suspicious blips quickly became glaring red flags on my monitoring app. It wasn't just a little juice. She was pulling it was a full-scale drain on my carefully stored power. Hundreds of kilowatts, gone by dawn. My battery, designed to carry me through the night and keep the house running smoothly, was left half empty every morning. It was like waking up to find someone had drained my bank account while I slept. The hypocrisy made my blood boil. Every morning, while I was struggling to figure out why my reserves kept vanishing, there was Karen standing in her driveway with that smug smile plastered on her face. Sipping her oat milk latte as if the world revolved around her, she'd wave, make some offhand comment about how green her Tesla was, and then go on bragging about how environmentally responsible she was for reducing her carbon footprint. The gall of it was staggering. She wasn't saving the planet. She was freeloading off my investment, off the years of planning and sacrifice I'd poured into building that solar grid. I tried to keep calm. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. So one morning, I decided to test the waters. We crossed paths as she was strutting back from her mailbox. Sunglasses perched on her nose like she was a celebrity dodging paparazzi. I forced a polite smile and kept my tone light, as if I were merely curious. "Hey Karen," I said casually. "Funny thing, I noticed my outlet's been used at night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" For a split second, I expected her to flinch, to stumble over her words, maybe even admit to it with an awkward laugh. But Karen's face didn't even twitch. Not a blink. Not a flicker of guilt. She didn't miss a beat as she launched into her explanation, her voice coated in that syrupy tone she always used when she thought she was being clever. "Oh, that. Community resources should be shared, don't you think?" She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like plugging her car into my private solar grid was no different than borrowing a cup of sugar. Then, just to twist the knife, she added, "Besides, the HOA hasn't even approved external outlets. So technically, yours shouldn't even be there." I nearly choked on my own breath. So there it was, classic Karen logic. She wasn't just stealing my power, she was framing it as my fault. In her twisted world, I was the rule breaker for daring to have an outlet on my property, and she was the virtuous neighbor, simply sharing community resources. The mental gymnastics it must have taken to arrive at that conclusion would have been impressive if it weren't so infuriating. But Karen didn't stop there. No, she doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up during the open floor portion and began bragging, loud and clear, about her Tesla. She went on and on about how amazing it was to drive electric, how cost-effective it had been for her, and then she dropped the bomb. The best part, I never spend a dime charging it. It practically powers itself. Neighbors chuckled politely, assuming she meant she had some brilliant home setup. Meanwhile, I sat there in my chair, jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. She wasn't just stealing my electricity, she was turning it into a badge of honor. She was bragging about it in public, spinning her theft into a personal achievement. The room filled with nods of approval. People admired her, praised her for being so forward-thinking, and all I could do was sit there in silence. Because how could I explain it? If I spoke up, she'd deny it. She'd twist the narrative, accuse me of making baseless claims. And with her reputation as the HOA watchdog, who would the neighbors believe? The guy with the unapproved outlet, or the self-proclaimed savior of the environment? I left that meeting angrier than I'd been in years. My hands shook the entire drive home. I kept replaying her words in my head. Never costs her a dime to charge. Of course it didn't cost her. It was costing me every single night while I was asleep. She was sneaking across the line between neighbor and thief, draining my grid dry, and then laughing about it in the daylight. That was the last straw. The days of politely ignoring it were over. The days of giving her the benefit of the doubt were done. If Karen wanted to play this game, then fine. She'd started it, but I was going to finish it. And I wasn't just going to stop, I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could outsmart me. I spent the next few days buried in a world I hadn't expected to enter. Manuals thicker than phone book, forum threads full of jargon and heated debates, and long, late-night phone calls with a friend who actually knew his way around inverters and grid controllers. I told myself I was doing it out of necessity, that I was simply learning everything I could about my own system so I could protect it. But there was another, darker pleasure to it. The electric hum of righteous scheming. My friend, an electrical engineer with a tired sense of humor, listened to my story, laughed at Karen's audacity, then calmly pointed out that most residential solar setups came with features the average homeowner never discovered unless they dug into menus and service modes. There are safety limits, diagnostic modes, and sometimes adjustable parameters," he said, deliberately vague, and I felt my pulse quicken. I made notes. I bookmarked threads. I learned the difference between nominal and peak outputs, between what an inverter is allowed to do and what it will do if you ask it nicely. But I was careful, almost obsessively so, to avoid anything that would be dangerous or reckless. I didn't want to cause real damage or put anyone at risk. I wanted only to create a moment of consequence, a comedic, humiliating correction that would leave Karen with nothing more than embarrassment and a busted ego. The ethics of it twisted inside my head. Sabotage, even a small, clever, kind, felt like crossing a line. But every time I replayed the footage of her slipping into my driveway at 2 in the morning, cable in hand, all self-righteousness and slippers, the argument for payback grew louder. She had turned my generosity or my oversight into her personal charging station. She'd turned my investment into her entitlement. If I could orchestrate a little karmic slap that caused no harm but taught her a lesson, who would I be to refuse? So I kept researching, always stopping short of anything that would result in permanent harm. I learned how my system reported loads, how the smart meter logged draws, and how the app showed charging sessions as entries with timestamps and anomalies. I learned that many EVs had graceful failure modes built in, the kind that trip a code, stop a charge, and politely tell you to go read a manual rather than explode. That knowledge changed everything. It meant there was a way to make a show without making a crime scene. I called my friend again and pitched the idea as a social experiment. Harmless, reversible, and theatrical. He harumphed and then, in the way friends do, gave me a cautionary list of do-nots and an encouraging shrug. "Don't do anything permanent," he said. "Don't provide a recipe for vandalism. And don't get arrested." I nodded, partly because I agreed and partly because the image of Karen in handcuffs was oddly satisfying in a purely cinematic way. With boundaries set, I dove into the control menus of my own system. There were toggles and modes I'd never touched, safety interlocks, diagnostic presets, and a quiet service option meant for text troubleshooting. Odd loads. I read tooltips instead of manuals now, and every tooltip sounded like a small secret lever I could pull to make a point without making headlines. I didn't write down specific voltages or procedural steps. I didn't need to. The thrill came from understanding the shape of the control, not the blueprint of destruction. When I finally felt confident that I could create exactly the kind of harmless disruption I wanted, a loud little hiccup rather than a catastrophe, I set up a watch. I rigged the notifications so my phone would chirp only when the outlet was in use. And I made sure there was a live camera framing the plug and the car. I composed a moral contingency plan for myself. 2. If anything started to look unsafe, I would abort immediately and call in a professional. It felt ridiculous to have to remind myself not to be a cartoon villain, but the reminder was necessary. The following night, the pattern repeated with maddening predictability. Under the low glow of the streetlight, Karen padded across the lawn in a ridiculous pink hoodie, hair in curlers like she'd rushed out of a bathroom commercial, and marched straight to my garage outlet with the casual entitlement of someone who believes the rules bend for her. She plugged in, glanced around like a conspirator, and then satisfied walked away. My camera caught every move. My heart beat a little faster as I unlocked the app and found the control I'd rehearsed in my head. The one that would create a hiccup large enough to rattle a charging system but small enough to be harmless. I hesitated, felt the familiar tug of doubt, and then tapped my phone. Voltage set to maximum, I told myself, but not in a way that would burn or break anything, only in a way the car's own systems would notice and politely refuse to continue. It was theater, not war. The garden lights blinked. My screen flashed. The game was on, ChatGPT said. At first, nothing dramatic happened, just that soft, mechanical hum you get when an electric car begins a charge. A kind of futuristic purr that had become background noise on our street. The Tesla's charging port glowed an obliging green, the little ring of light promising that all was well, that electrons were flowing exactly where they were supposed to. For a beat, I thought maybe my plan had been overblown. Maybe she'd plug in, get her fill, and walk away none the wiser. Then the sound changed, a short, decisive click, followed by an insistent beep. The green halo winked out, and a harsh red ring replaced it, like a tiny alarm bell. The dash display lit up with terse, bureaucratic messages: charging error, check power source, external voltage out of range. My chest tightened with a stupid, childish glee. From my upstairs window, I watched Karen's figure stiffen in the driver's seat, then tumble out of the car in that theatrical way she reserved for moments when the world failed to bend to her will. She stomped back across the driveway, face flushed, muttering under her breath like someone reciting a litany of insults to luck itself. Her movements were sharp, hands on hips, shoulders, hunched, the physical punctuation of someone rapidly losing composure. She yanked the cable out with a kind of aggressive flourish, then jabbed it back into the port as if sheer force might convince the electronics to accept her claim. The Tesla's screen blinked again. Same error. She tried a second time, then a third, each attempt more desperate than the last, more frantic with the realization that the car simply would not cooperate. Finally, she abandoned brute force for technology. She pulled out her phone, thumbs flying, likely riffling through Tessalona forums at 2 in the morning, searching for a miracle or a homebrew solution. The way she stood, head bent over that glowing rectangle. You could see panic writ plain across her features, the eyes a little too wide, the jaw set like a trap. I'd half expected tears. What I got instead was the brittle, defensive outrage of someone whose entitlement had been checked. From my vantage point, I sipped my coffee and became an amused spectator to her meltdown, feeling a ridiculous sense of theatrical satisfaction, as if I'd placed myself in the director's chair of a private, very petty play. Every time she shoved the plug back in, my phone chimed with a notification from the solar app I'd rigged to watch for unauthorized draws, little judgmental pings that felt almost smug. Unauthorized draw detected. Charging attempt failed. The app logged times. It recorded her failure with clinical precision. It sat there like a digital witness. 20 minutes of fruitless attempts passed. Karen paced the driveway, stomped, glared at my garage outlet as if a stare could shame hardware into submission. And finally, with a theatrical groan that could have been written by a sitcom, she slammed the car door and peeled out of my street as if speed could erase humiliation. The next morning she arrived at the HOA meeting looking like a thunderhead, angry, righteous, and dangerously loud. She took the floor with the practiced cadence of someone used to commanding attention, spinning a dramatized tale about dangerous, unregulated equipment on a private property that was somehow interfering with the delicate electronics of modern electric vehicles. Her voice had that syrupy, performative inflection she used whenever she wanted sympathy and a little outrage from an audience. She talked about safety, about community standards, about the moral imperative to protect residents from rogue technology. The irony of it was almost cruel. Here she was, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood virtue, publicly decrying the very innovation she'd been exploiting in private. People shifted in their chairs. A few eyebrows lifted. Others exchanged knowing looks. I sat back with my arms folded, trying not to smile too broadly as the room reacted. Some neighbors murmured agreement. Safety is an easy banner to rally under, but more than a few rolled their eyes at Karen's melodrama. The way she pushed for immediate action without offering specifics or evidence, a couple of folks even chuckled under their breath, remembering the hush of late-night activity and the sight of a white Tesla slipping out of my driveway at dawn. The contrast between her public indignation and the footage I'd watched the night before felt like a private joke shared between my phone and me. When she finished, flushed and expectant of applause, the board asked a few pointed questions about the supposed interference, and that's when I felt the moment. There was an opening, a small ethical duty to speak up, but more than that, a delicious anticipation at the thought of watching her try to spin out of a claim she couldn't back with facts. I stayed silent in the meeting that day, partly out of strategy, and partly because I wanted to enjoy for a little longer the afterglow of what I'd orchestrated. I'd created a moment of consequence, humiliating, reversible, and entirely hers to own. Watching Karen sputter and grandstand about dangerous equipment, while the neighbors processed the dissonance between her speech and her actions, was a private, perfect revenge, one that didn't cost anyone anything but pride. For a few nights, Karen stayed away, and I told myself it was over. Maybe her Tesla had finally forgiven her, or maybe she'd taken to charging at a friend's house, or maybe she'd simply decided the whole episode had been too embarrassing to repeat. I enjoyed the quiet. I enjoyed watching my battery percentages rise overnight, without the nagging dip at dawn that had become a little betrayal in the back of my mind. But Karen never let go of a free ride for long. On the 5th night after her theatrics, she returned with the kind of steely determination that made you realize this wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about entitlement and wounded pride. She didn't slink into my driveway like a thief this time. She came armed with a flashlight and a purposeful stride, like an amateur electrician on a mission to reclaim what she felt was owed. I watched her on the camera, illuminated in the cone of the street lamp, flashlight beam bobbing as she bent to inspect the outlet as if it were a foreign object requiring forensic attention. There was something comic in the way she poked and prodded, muttering to herself under her breath. But there was also a menacing edge, the kind of neighbor who treats other people's property as a challenge rather than a boundary. She plugged in, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, then nothing. The charge light didn't glow obligingly. The port didn't accept the cable like it had in the past. My smart app, which I'd quietly adjusted to be a vigilant sentinel, reported nothing. The outlet denied the connection in the polite, clinical language of modern tech. Karen tried again, more forcefully, as if sheer insistence could will electrons to flow. She cursed softly, then loudly, an unladylike string of expletives that made the neighbor's picture postcard facade of civility wobble. She tried a third time, and then a fourth, each attempt more frantic. I'd set up a block that could recognize charging signatures, an innocuous, almost bureaucratic-sounding safeguard that in practice meant her car wouldn't be granted a single watt. I felt a curious mix of triumph and relief. Triumphant because she couldn't siphon my investment any longer. Relieved because the solution I'd put in place did not harm anyone or anything, it simply enforced my property rights. Furious, humiliated, and probably running out of rationalizations, Karen marched up my walkway and pounded on my door with the devastating confidence of someone used to getting her way. The pounding echoed in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You can't deny community resources," she screamed through the door, voice shrill and theatrical. "This is against HOA regulations." Her argument was familiar, a contortion of rules into a cudgel to beat anyone who challenged her agenda. I opened the door calmly because I knew the spectacle she wanted, the gasps, the neighbors peeking out, the sympathy, and I refused to give it to her. "Karen," I said, measured and tired, "this is my solar grid. It's not community property, and I have every video of you stealing power." I let the words hang there like a verdict. Her face, usually a mask of smugness that never surrendered an inch, drained of color the way a storm cloud loses its depth under bright sun. For the first time in my dealings with her, she didn't have a snappy retort, a procedural dodge, or a moralistic pivot. She looked smaller, not because she'd lost her status only, because the one thing she used to wield, certainty, had been taken away. I finished the sentence. "One more stunt, and I'll share the footage with the HOA and with the police." The simplicity of it felt surgical. It removed the gray area she'd lived in and put the facts on record. She spun on her heel, stomped to her car, and stormed off in a cloud of outrage that sounded more desperate than defiant. The next HOA meeting was the sweetest yet. A coronation of normalcy where the board praised my eco-friendly initiative and even asked if I'd be willing to host a workshop on solar setups so other neighbors could learn to adopt clean energy. I sat in the back, arms folded, while Karen, who had spent so long trying to control the narrative, sat uncharacteristically silent. Her glare was a constant, poisonous thing aimed my way, but this time it had little bite. The board's questions were practical, the neighbors' comments curious and positive, and for once the story being told in the room matched the facts I'd recorded. Renewable energy, homeowner investment, community education. It felt like reclaiming a small democratic victory in the microcosm of suburban governance. My system was safe. My power belonged to me. And Karen, well, she learned the hard way that entitlement only lasts until someone enforces a boundary. If you mess with someone's grid, you might think you're getting away with something, but there's always a limit to freeloading, and sometimes, when that limit is reached, the only thing left to do is turn the lights on and show the world what's been happening under cover of night.